All right, so we need to go back and just take a look at the wrap up from last week. We had the story of the garden, which was, again, no parallel in the EP story. And now we have the story of Cain and Abel, which again have no parallel in the EP story. And there's obviously a lot of material here that we're not going to deal with as far as because we're looking for parallel stories. And one of the reasons I would say that there is no parallel story to the Garden of Eden that we talked about last time, no story about the expulsion from the garden or the Adam and the Chava, the Isha, the male and the female being created out of the male, and then they're creating children together, is that the divinity of the two stories is not the same. The process of creation is not the same. And the process of creating humans and the role of humans is not the same in the two stories. So uh, the process of creating in Genesis 1, remember, was creating in the likeness of the divine, in the likeness of the creator. And the creator of the Genesis 1 story is a creator who is omnigendered and capable of creating by word and immortal. And the creation, which is a copy, and a copy is never actually the full aspect. Something disappears when you take a photo or when you draw a picture or when you create something in the image of something else. When you move from 3 dimensions to 2 dimensions from the human standpoint, you're missing something, and you try to replace it with perspective and other kinds of things. So the creation by the creator, the divine creator in Genesis 1, was a semi-divine creation who we're going to see when we go now to chapter 5 is a creator in its own right, is omnigendered, and probably is uh, long-lived, but not immortal. So certain aspects of the divine disappear, but the divine, we know what the creator is like because we're told what the creation is like, and we're told that the creation is like the creator. And so if the creation is multi-gendered, can be both singular and plural at the same time, and is capable of creating also, then what is missing is the immortality and the ability to create out of nothing. And that may reflect, again, a vision or a view of the coastal peoples who would have been writing that story.
Right. You're saying that the E stories are sort of a copy of the Y stories?
No, I'm saying that there are parallel stories between the E story and the Y story. Neither one is a copy of the other. I'm saying the divinity in the E story shows that the human is created as a copy of the creator, the divine.
Oh, I see.
And
In
so
the
in
E
the E
story.
story, the creation of the Adam is semi-divine.
I see. I see.
And semi-divine because it has certain aspects of the divine that is omnigendered and able to create, but not fully divine because it is not immortal and does not necessarily create out of nothing. I looked up the Latin term for the Genesis 1 creator, and the common Latin term is creatio ex nihilo, able to create out of nothing. But I expanded that view to, depending on whether you want to say by speaking or by divine fiat, creatio ex nihilo perloquendum, a good Latin rolls right off the tongue. Or if you say divine fiat, it's creatio ex nihilo decretum divinum.
And what are you saying about the people of the Y stories? How do
And
they?
so the why story, we're told at the end of the garden story that the eating of the tree of the knowledge of Tov and Ra now is stated that that creation now is like the divine. The end of chapter 3, God says, now that Adam and Chavel, Adam, Ish and Isha, now that my creation, my humans have eaten from the tree, they are like us, knowing Tov and Ra. So the creator of Genesis 2 of the Y story is a creator who is not uh, omnigendered, but rather is omniscient, is all knowing, knowing choice and consequence, knowing the difference between Tov and Ra. And when the humans eat from the tree and know the difference between Tov and Ra, when they become all knowing or capable of knowing, they become like the divine. And in both cases, the divine is immortal and the creation is not immortal. The creation is mortal. In Genesis 1, we find out that mortality when we get to Genesis 5, and we find out that the creator, the creation, the human, dies. In Genesis 2, we find out that they are not immortal, that they become mortal because they were always mortal. They just never ate from the tree of immortality. Also, the creator of Genesis 1, the creator, creates from nothingness, whereas the creator of 2, the Y creator, is much more the fashioner of new creations out of existent material. So, for example, the human is semi-divine to the extent that the human is created from the dust of the earth and infused with the breath of the divine. So there's a different view of how creation worked, where humans came from, how humans are reflections of the divine, which then tells us what the divine is. So that was all what we got from the chapter 3 of the Y story. There's no parallel. What I'm saying is there's no parallel to, in a sense, the dividing of the human into male and female parts in the Y story until we get the offspring, the creations of the second generation creations. Also, the chapter 4, which is now this, the story of Cain and Hevel, the story of Cain and Abel, has no parallel because the society of the coastal region would most likely have been much more homogeneous. They were all related to some aspect of the fishing or seafaring industry. The inland, the river cultures or the upland people, the people of the Y story, were not homogeneous because there were farmers and there were shepherds. And the farmer type people would actually have been the ones who created societies, created empires. The shepherd people, the Bedouins, it's very hard to create an empire when you don't have a place to seat the center of your empire. So the Bedouin people, the nomadic people, the shepherding people of the world, of the inland world, who are actually the ancestors of the Torah people, they win and lose at the same time. That is, Hevel, Abel, is a shepherd. Cain is a farmer. Cain, we're going to see, actually found cities. That's coming up in this week's generation story. Cain found cities. Abel, on the other hand, can't found anything because he's killed before he can reproduce. So shepherds have to come from someplace else because Abel doesn't give offspring. But we can figure that one out when we get the whole creation of humans starting all over again from Noah. So all of this Cain and Abel story is just the conflict between the farming community, the farming world, and the shepherd world. And uh, the idea of asking questions like, where is your brother? God asking Adam, what did you do? Who told you were naked? There's a third aspect to the divine that, again, is not reproduced in the human. And that is the divine knows choice and consequence, and the divine takes responsibility. The human, by eating from the tree, knows choice and consequence, but does not take responsibility, as seen in Genesis chapter 3 in the garden story, when God says to the man, what did you do? He said, it's the woman's fault. And God said to the woman, what did you do? And she says, it was the snake's fault. So there's always passing the buck. And then in chapter 4, God says to Cain, what did you do? He says, I don't know what you're talking about. Where's your brother? Like, you just killed him. Wasn't intentional, since prior to that, there had been no sense of mortality. You didn't mean to kill him, but you did. Will you fess up to it? Will you own up to it? And Cain says, nope, I won't. So that again becomes a part of the story in the Y story that is not replicated in the E story. What is replicated in the E story is creating new generations. Now, Genesis chapter 5, verse 1 is the Adam. And there is no male and female. There is only the Adam, who at the end of Genesis chapter 1, the Adam was created, remember, male and female. God created them, God created it, singular and plural, all interchangeable verbs and nouns dealing with, and pronouns, dealing with the initial creation, the Adam. What Genesis chapter 5, verse 1 says, the Adam then creates an offspring after its own image and after its own language. Genesis chapter 5, verse 1 repeats the language that ended Genesis chapter 1 by saying that the Adam creates an offspring like itself. Whereas in the Genesis, the Y story, the female is created from the male. And again, rather than creating by divine fiat, by speaking into existence from nothingness, the Y story has the creation of the human out of something, is fashioned rather than created out of nothing. And the woman is fashioned out of the thing, the human that was created out of the dust. So in a sense, the human that's created in the Y story has the potential to have a female and is not actualized until the female is built out of the male. Whereas in the E story, the human is a divinely spoken entity, not created out of anything pre-existent. And then we get the human in creating the offspring like itself in its own image, male and female, singular and plural, all at the same time. The entity that was created was called Shet, Seth. Shet then creates. It says, the Hebrew says vayoled, which means give birth to, but also gives rise to. Shet creates an entity called Enosh. What the text has in throughout uh, throughout its text, what's missing in these intervening verses 7 and 8, 10 and 11, 13 and 14, and 1 through and 2 through 5 is, after creating the singular plural omnigendered entity, the creation then creates sons and daughters, separate male and female entities. What's going on in the E story, I believe, is that way back in Genesis chapter 1, God says to the created entity, be fruitful and multiply. God does not, however, in Genesis chapter 1, tell the created entity how to be fruitful and multiply. And so the initial attempt to be fruitful and multiply by the created entity, the Adam, is to clone a similar offspring, to create an entity that is also both male and female, and that is the Shet. However, the Shet is not capable of procreating. And so therefore, the Adam then, possibly in a modern language science way, buds rather than clones. And so the Adam, which is singular and plural, male and female, all at the same time, buds a singular male off on one side and a singular female off on the other side. Goes through a process of mitosis, and then separates out its X's from its Y's, and then creates the Y entity and the X entity. And of course, because we have to duplicate, then we've got the XX and the XY, but I'm not sure that the biblical author had any sense of the DNA model of human offspring, but certainly the recognition that some come out as male and some come out as female. And that happened because the original entity, which was both, said, I'm going to create a bunch of X's and a bunch of Y's.
So are
And
it's like Shet's and Ashkenan, they're all buds? They're not.
no, they're all clones. It's the verses that are missing in between, which say, and then they had sons and daughters.
Oh,
And the sons and daughters are the buds, the male buds and the female buds, separated out. And once you create the male and female as separate entities, you are then capable of procreating. But prior to male and female buds, you can only clone, you can't procreate.
so all these were cloned?
All of these are clones. Shet is a clone that then clones Enosh. Enosh clones Canaan. And then we're told, and then Enosh had a bunch of sons and daughters. And then Canaan. So what we're creating here are semi-divine entities. That is a whole series of generations of Adam type, of creation copies.
Hmm.
And what we're going to get in our pre-flood reasons in the E story is what happens to these semi-divines. So the generations are Shet, then Enosh, then Canaan, then Mahalalel, then Yered, and then Chanoch. And Chanoch goes to Metushalach. And then we get in verse 24 an interesting little thing, because Chanoch never dies. Chanoch, by the way, lived a very nice number, 365 years. So he lived a year of days. So he lives 365 years, and he walks with God, and he is no more. So thus Enoch becomes the first never died personage in the Torah, which leads to a whole bunch of later apocryphal and pseudepigraphal writings about Enoch being able to come back because he never died in the first place. The next person who can do that after Enoch is Elijah. After Enoch, Elijah never dies, but mounts the space shuttle and heads up to the International Space Station to hang out with God. But Elijah goes up there and finds that Enoch's already hanging out with God, which is why you can have a musical group called Enoch Light. All of this from one little verse in Genesis. And then Methuselah gives birth to Lamech, and Lamech gives birth to Noah. And Noah finally gives birth to three. And it seems, because Noah's three get married, that Noah no longer can clone. Noah can only birth males.
So Noah was the first one to actually birth?
Well, yes, because the sons and daughters in all the previous generations were not told yet what they did, what happened to them. The other thing of note in the E story is we're given very specific time frames. We're told how old each one was when it cloned, how long it continued to then birth males and females separately, and how long it lived. And the longest living one in this will be Methuselah, who ends up living 969 years. A few key characters in here are Methuselah, because he's the longest living, Chanoch, because his life is 365, and Lamech, whose life is 777. Nothing else said about them or why they're given that. And Lamech ends up with Noah, and Noah then is going to be the lead us into the story of the flood, the repopulation of the earth after the first population of the earth failed. How and why it failed, we'll get next week, actually in 2 weeks. Meanwhile, on the other side, Abel is dead. Cain and his woman, we were not told where she came from, because at this point, all we had in the Y story was the Adam and his sidekick, literally, give birth to two boys, Cain and Hevel. And then we had that whole story in chapter 4 about the Cain and Hevel and their clash and the end of Hevel. And then Cain goes and finds a woman, but there are no women. So where did Cain find his woman? Again, would be the Y story, which is the shepherd story, and doesn't say that this was the only human that was created, just this was the Garden of Eden human that was created. So we have silence, which means we have lots of opportunity for midrash, and midrash can be whatever you want. If you take the Torah in its entirety now, this woman that Cain found is one of those male and female, the sons and daughters that his parents, Adam and Chava, had from the other story. So if you treat the two stories as one combined story, then the boys from one story can get the girls from the other story. If you view them as being the independent stories, which form criticism does and says the Y story, verse 17, where did Cain get the woman? The answer is, who cares? From one of those other women that were out there in the world, because they were women and men of no consequence because they were never in the garden in the first place. And we then have to just do lots of midrash around that. But notice that Cain's first offspring is Chanoch, here in verse 17. Over on the other side in verse 18, 5 generations later comes a guy by the name of Chanoch. And we're going to see parallel names between the two stories, but different orders of birth, different places within the genealogy. Does this come from borrowing of the two cultures with each other? Does this come from some common base genealogy story that both worked from? And the answer, of course, is we have no idea. But there seemed to be some some statement of the antediluvian, the pre-flood names, and they have a common root within these two particular stories. Chanoch in both stories is of note. Chanoch in the E story was of note because he walked with God and was no more. Chanoch in the Y story is the first city builder. That is, there was a city that was built and it was called the city of Chanoch. So again, this may be an empire statement. This may be a social statement of the first city in the biblical story was the city of Chanoch, not the city of Ur, and not any other city, but the city of Chanoch. Chanoch then gives an offspring of Irad, which is amazingly similar to over here in verse 15, Yered. Irad and Yered, by the way, are spelled the same way, just have different vowels. Irad gives first birth to Mechuyael, which is very similar sounding to Mahalalel. Mechuyael gives birth to Metushael. Metushael is very similar to Metushalach.
Maybe just regional accent differences.
Exactly. Again, we don't know if there's a common story of the pre-flood generations that are now being played out in different birth orders with different local pronunciations. Or if early on, the E and the Y stories actually had some cultural interchange and took the names of each one. Again, we don't know where they came from. All we can do is point out to the fact that there are parallel stories. And notice the final generation of the E story is Lamech. And the final generation of the Y story is Lamech. Lamech in the E story gives birth to Noach. And Lamech, by the way, in the E story has a very interesting little insert, the part that we didn't read, is Lamech says about Noach, I'm calling him Noach because he will be the comfort for us. He will menacha. from our deeds and our toil in our hands, from the ground that cursed Y. So the blending in the E story of a Y story is an indication possibly that this was actually neither story, but this was a creation of the editor redactor to blend the two stories back together and make it seem like we are only one story. In the Y story, Lamech is the last generation before the flood. But notice we get in the Lamech story a whole long story about his two wives and his offspring. One of his wives is Adah, and the others of his wives is Selah. We're not told, by the way, from Cain until Lamech, that we're not told about any of the women that are giving the birth. But the structure of the story would tend to indicate that each of these guys found some woman and gave birth to the next generation. Lamech, we're told specifically, his two wives. And Adah gives birth to Yaval, who is the father of the tent dwellers and cattle herders. In other words, we lost Abel as the progenitor of shepherds. We need a new shepherd ancestor, and that's Yaval. And they were very creative with names because Yaval's brother is Yuval. It's like the guy who his sister asked him to go to town hall and register the names of the twins that were born. And he comes back and he gives her the certificate. And she said, "Oh, you named our girl Denise. What a nice name." And then she looks at the other one and said, "What, you named our boy Denephew?" So Adah gives birth to Yaval and Yuval. And Yavel becomes the ancestor to all of the shepherds. So we got shepherds back in the mix. And Yuval becomes the ancestor to all the musicians. And we're told that Yuval gave birth to those who are able to play string instruments and wind instruments. Tzilah rather, also gives birth to a child by the name of Tuval Cain. And Tuval and Yuval and Yavel are very similar names. And guess where Tzila got the name Cain? So Tuval Cain, we're now remembering our original ancestor Cain. And Tuval Cain then is the ancestor of all of those who create civilization, copper workers and iron workers. And Sila then also gives birth to a girl whose name, interestingly, is Naamah. And the story ends there. And notice Lamech in this story gives birth to Noach, and Noah in this story gives birth to Naamah. And Noach and Naamah are parallel terms in Hebrew. And when you combine the two stories, guess what Noach's wife's name is that's never mentioned in the E or Y stories thereafter? Noach's wife's name is Naamah.
I was going to say that, but I wasn't sure.
Yep, that's the Midrash. It's only one story. And Noach marries his distant cousin. I mean, this is 10th generation removed cousin, so it's not exactly close. But he marries his cousin Naamah, and that's how he gives birth to Shem, Ham, and Japhet. Meanwhile, verse 23 suddenly gives us a story about Lamech, who says poetically, and this is then a further indicator. There are modern scholars basically say that the E story is mostly composed in poetic style. The Y story is mostly composed in prose style. Prose, we tend to think, is a later version of stories, and poetry, we tend to think in the Torah, indicates the earliest strain of the story. So the fact that there is a poetic insert in the Y story in verse 23, modern scholarship would probably say is an indication that this is an older strain of the story from someplace else. So there's a Lamech E story, which gives birth to Noach. There's a Lamech Y story that gives birth to Naamah among the other brothers. And there's a Lamech third story that relates Lamech back to his ancestor Cain. And we have a fragment possibly of that story. And Lamech says poetically, and we know it's poetically because we have parallel construction. Ada and Sila, hear my voice. Women of Lamech, give ear to my saying. Ada and Sila are women of Lamech. Hear my voice and give ear to my saying are parallel terms as well. They're both say, listen up. So that structure tells us that this is poetic. And then because a man I killed, wounding me, a boy I hurt. Again, parallel structure. Have no idea at all in the Torah what he's talking about here. There is no story of Lamech ever attacking somebody in the way that Cain attacked his brother. And then, because I did it double 7, therefore my punishment is 77.
What does that mean?
Exactly. Probably in the context, if we ever find a preserved papyrus writing of the third Lamech story, or some parallel clay tablet from a Ugaritic or Akkadian or Babylonian or Mesopotamian or somebody elsean story of this is the story of Lamech and his wounding of another. We have no idea what he's talking about. But for some reason, this Lamech story was known to the Y author, and therefore this fragment of the Lamech story was included by the Y author in their ultimate writing of the story of Lamech. So Lamech in the E story is simply the father of Noach, or the creator of Noach. Lamech in the Y story is this whole end of the story. Then we get verses 25 and 26, which is the end of the chapter 4. And it says, after we've been getting all of these generations from Cain down to Lamech, all of a sudden Adam gives birth again with his woman, with Ishto. And they call the name of that child Shet. So Adam and Eve have a third son by the name of Shet. And Shet then in verse 26, to end chapter 4, gives birth to a man by the name of Enosh. And Enosh is the first time that people begin to use God's name in human language. So keep in mind, Adam and Eve in the Y story had Cain and Abel. Cain and Abel in chapter 4 have this falling out. And Cain hits Abel, pushes him over a cliff, does something, and Abel dies. And Cain looks down and says, wow, how did that happen? And then God says, what's up with your brother? He says, I have no idea. And that whole story. And then Cain has a whole bunch of offspring down to Lamech, and from Lamech down to Naamah. And then all of a sudden, at the very end of chapter 4, and this statement, these verses 25 and 26, could, I would say, most logically have been put right after Cain kills Abel. Way back at the beginning of chapter 4, could have been said, and Adam and Eve were so distraught at the loss of one of their sons, and they gave birth to another son. That would make sense chronologically. But if we're putting the two stories together and making it seem as if chapter 4 leads straight into chapter 5, as opposed to the E construction, which is chapter 1 leads straight into chapter 5, we have to go back to Adam and Eve and have a son from them named Shet, and then have a son from them, from Shet, named Enosh, and we go back to E, and notice what happens at the beginning of chapter 5. Adam creates Shet, and Shet creates Enosh. And then it's
Question. Oh,
yeah.
sorry, Rabbi Sam. I have a question, and this could be totally from left field, but I think you said earlier that the verb for giving birth is, we kept saying yoledet.
Yoled, yes.
Yoled, yeah.
Yes.
And is this same verb used, I think, is yalda also?
Yes, Yeled,
Okay.
Yalda,
Okay.
yes.
So is there
No.
no differentiation between, like we say in English, we say create something, and then we say procreate, and they
Mhm.
have different meanings.
Right.
So here, it seems like the word birth is used for creation. I mean, it's a kind of birth, I guess,
Yes,
but
it's a
then
kind
once
of
there
word,
are,
yes.
once there are men and women, it doesn't really change in the language.
Right. And prior to there being men and women, the statement of Genesis 5:1 of Adam is he makes Shet,
Makes.
Shet. After that, they are all then created without procreation. So
Okay.
yeah. So I mean, the word Yoled actually can be translated as have offspring.
Oh, okay.
And the normal root in the male-female world of having offspring is procreation.
Right.
The normal root in the E story, in the singular, plural, omnigendered, is clone. And clone is another way of having offspring. Or bud, which is another way of having offspring. And within the world of creation, there are, in fact, animals and plants that have offspring by cloning,
Right.
and have offspring by budding. That is asexual offspring. And there are those that have offspring by sexual offspring. The Hebrew doesn't differentiate among all of those because they're not dealing with the language of the modern science world.
Okay. I mean, yeah, I
Yes.
understand they didn't have a word for clone, but I just wondered if there was a why they might not have used different words for the different
Yeah.
kinds of creation.
Yeah, at the beginning, yes. But once we get from divine creation to human creation, pretty much the word is have offspring. And by putting Genesis 4, Shet to Enosh at the end of Genesis 4, and then having the creation, the offspring, the cloning of Adam to a Shet, and then the cloning of Shet to an Enosh, it's just too convenient. And thus it's most likely put into the language of the editor-redactor, who ends the story of Y with Na'amah, and with that whole fragment of Lemech, and now has to get us ready for chapter 5. And remember, the original editor-redactor did not create chapters. That doesn't happen till about the 11th century. Prior to that, it's just the scroll. And in the scroll, we go from the end of chapter 4 to the beginning of chapter 5 with just from section to section to section. So that was a perfect place for the editor-redactor to put it in, because they then blend what the editor-redactor knew was two separate stories into one continuous story. Next week, why do we need a flood? Chapter 6. And notice now, when we get to next week, it's not so easy. Because up until this point, we had Genesis 1, Genesis 5, E story with a little editor-redactor stuff. Genesis 2, 3, and 4, Y story with a little bit of fragmentary material and editor-redactor stuff. Once we get to chapter 6, we have E and Y interspersed with each other, not as two separate stories, but as one continuous flood story from two separate texts that were rammed together. So we have to go from 1 and 2 to 3 over here, to 4 over here, to 5 over here, to 6 over here, and 7 over here, 8, 9, and 10 over here, back to 11 over here, and 12 over here. So parsing them out into the two separate stories has to be done based on other aspects other than simply, well, we have two separate sections, we can look at them separately. Now we have one common flow, all done in more prose style. So we leave the poetic style of the creation into the more prose style of possibly, therefore, a slightly later version. But EP would have had, I argue, a coastal story, and Y would have had, I argue, an inland story. And it turns out that my division by coastal and inland actually do match the divisions that were done on the basis of language, E versus Y, the naming of the deity. So I think my thesis bolsters the form critical as opposed to opposes. So we're going to look at and your reading for next week is those two stories, those two pre-flood reasons. So this is the one, it says 8:10, because it's not next week, it's the following week, 2 weeks from today. We'll be meeting together to look at how did humans mess it up. In the Y story, it's easy. It started with the first generation that messed it up by trying to become divine by eating from the tree of knowing Tov and Ra. And then their offspring continued to mess it up by having fratricide, brother killing brother. And then apparently they continued to mess it up down to Lemech, who is 7 times as bad as his ancestor Cain. And we end with then the generation of the flood, which in the Y story was the generation of Na'amah. And in the E story, we don't yet know in Genesis chapter 5 how they messed it up. That is, Genesis 1, they are there. They are told to be fruitful and multiply. Genesis 5, they go about being fruitful and multiply. And we don't know if they mess it up by being fruitful and multiply in the wrong way, or by being fruitful and multiply in two different ways when they were supposed to. We don't know there's no statement in Genesis chapter 5 of anything being wrong. There's only a statement of the semi-divine, the mortal semi-divine, creating new generations of semi-divine and generations of non-divine, that is human. We have to wait till the E story picks up in Genesis 6, verse 1, that says, what did those guys do wrong? And that's what we'll be looking at in 2 weeks, is what did those guys do wrong? Genesis 6, the Y story, we don't have to worry about what they did wrong. We just have to worry about how wrong did they get. And that's going to be, again, a parallel between the two stories and a difference. The coastal story, what did we do wrong? The inland story, how wrong did we get? The coastal story, whatever we did wrong, it merited starting all over again. The E story, the Y story, the inland story, much more clearly, it got so wrong, we have to start all over again. So that's what we'll be looking at on August 10th.
Hugs for Jenny.